The video you're about to see is an AI-generated version from my Russian, or original or native, YouTube channel. I've lived in the combat zone for more than 10 years, and I've got a lot to say, because I've worked in the field for more than 5 years. And not only that, but I have some real-life examples of how stuff works and how it doesn't. So stay tuned, subscribe and put like button, and tell me, what do you think about those AI generated versions?
So, while the world that used to laugh at the theory that we're all ruled by phil-oligarchs is now gobsmacked to find out that we really are ruled by phil-oligarchs. We're going to head off in a slightly different direction and talk about our favourite military operations, because they haven't gone anywhere. And they, to a much lesser extent, depend on newphiles or oligarchs. And today I want to talk about something that many of us have probably forgotten, namely our beloved aeroplanes and helicopters. For the past 50 years, there's been a distinct role for two classes of aircraft: attack aircraft and killers. That is, helicopters and planes that operate directly on the battlefield and provide support to the troops. And in just the last 2 or 3 years, we can see this role simply dying before our very eyes. We've all grown used to and love these images. It's the image of the heroic pilot who charges into battle, strikes and disappears into the sunset. There have been loads of films made about this, and quite a large number of video games as well. But unfortunately, in 2026, this hero dies, never having reached their goal. Today, let's look into why that is. Ka-52 Su-25 A-10. And Apaches have become an endangered species, so who has replaced them and how? The first aerial assault attacks actually didn't take place in the First World War, but in the Italo-Turkish War. The Italians dropped bombs and darts from Newport and Blériot aircraft onto Turkish troops. Now, in the First World War, there was already a shift from bombing to close support of the infantry. In 1917, Germany introduced the Junkers J-4, the first mass-produced ground attack aircraft with duralumin armour capable of withstanding incendiary bullets. And then, in February 1918, the Entente established a system of reserve aircraft for immediate infantry support at the request of commanders. But it was the USSR that truly became a pioneer of the concept. In 1925, the USSR specified single and twin-engine light, high-speed armoured ground attack aircraft. Later, the World War II Il-2 proved a major breakthrough. In January 1938, Ilyushin proposed a two-seat armoured attacker, outperforming Ivanov program rivals in payload and armament. Autumn 1939 saw the first flight of the Il-2. The aim was to create a flying tank for destroying enemy personnel and military equipment from low altitudes. And in 1941, mass production of this aircraft began. And in August, the first battles near Moscow took place, where its effectiveness against tanks was confirmed. At this early stage, the key innovations of these flying tanks were heavy armour and good weaponry. These included machine guns and bombs, which were dropped from low altitudes for accuracy. The tactic was to accompany the infantry and attack moving targets. And it was precisely at this time that the sketches and outlines for the future were born, the way we now see and perceive attack aviation. The Germans nicknamed the L-2 the Black Death because of its high effectiveness against tanks. But after the Second World War, after the Great Patriotic War, all countries somehow forgot about and neglected attack aviation. Quite simply because air defence systems were already developing well, and generally speaking, it just wasn't a priority. The war had only just ended, and no one was really thinking about aeroplanes, let alone helicopters. And overall, more work was being done on jet aviation rather than subsonic aircraft. But then Vietnam changed everything, because in Vietnam the United States faced a great number of difficulties, and they needed a machine to support the troops. And this is where the first real attack aircraft, the ones we know today, appear. In 1966, a program was launched in the United States which would later result in the A-10 aircraft, which entered mass production in 1976. In the Soviet Union, the Su-25 project began in 1972, with its first flight taking place in 1975, and it entered mass production in 1979, so the European theatre of war. The story with helicopters is a bit different. The first attack helicopter, considered the progenitor of the class, was the Cobra. But the Cobra was more of a modification, really. The first true attack helicopter was the Mi-24, developed by the Soviet Union, which made its maiden flight in 1969. This is a unique flying infantry fighting vehicle featuring not only a combat compartment but also a troop section, which received its baptism of fire in Afghanistan. In the United States, however, in 1976, a program began which would later result in the Apache, widely regarded as perhaps the best helicopter of its era, specifically from the 1980s to the late 2000s. So what exactly was the Apache? That is, if we're talking about the Mi-24, the Crocodile, then the Crocodile is first and foremost an airborne cannon. A 30mm cannon and unguided rockets. The Apache, on the other hand, was a far more sophisticated technical machine, and its main task was not just to carry a cannon and carry unguided rockets, but first and foremost, and most importantly, the primary armament of the Apache was, of course, the Hellfire anti-tank guided missile. And here, those in the know who follow combat operations and military technology can already draw some analogies. After all, there are now a great many means that accomplish this task much more simply. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The Apache's tactics were quite straightforward. It's a low observable helicopter that flying at treetop level, in other words, practically skimming its belly over the treetops, it approaches the enemy and destroys their equipment and their radars. In 1991, while the Soviet Union was falling apart, the Apache kicked off the famous Desert Storm. This was a landmark beginning and a moment of glory for this helicopter. Apache helicopters penetrated deep into Iraq and destroyed, simply sliced through radars and key elements. The air defense systems, which in fact contributed to the swift conclusion of Desert Storm. Helicopters like the Mi-24 and the Apache, and aircraft such as the A-10 and Su-25 became extremely popular not just among the military, but with the public as well. And of course, all this is enhanced by their visual charisma, as the very design of these helicopters is rather brutal. They're like armoured monsters with massive cannons. The A-10 even has a shark's mouth painted on its nose, and the cannon around which the aircraft was essentially built, the GAU-8, literally sticks out of this mouth. We've all seen the damage sustained by the A-10 and Su-25, after which they still managed to return to base, whereas any other aircraft or helicopter would never have made it back in a million years. But the combat itself, of course, is far more spectacular than simply flying high in the atmosphere, firing a missile and flying back. This is the cultural phenomenon of these military machines, which both popular culture and gaming culture, as well as the overall image of a militaristic state, be it the States or Russia, successfully capitalize on. And so we come to probably the pinnacle of the evolution of these machines. Obviously, the best modern helicopter, the Ka-52. The Alligator is the world's top helicopter. It has no equivalents given its unique features. Key features include, firstly, it's the first with the K-37-8 100 ejection seat. So far, there are no other mass-produced machines like it in operation. Coaxial rotor-assisted. Some say it's risky, but the absence of a tail rotor gives it unique maneuverability. It can perform funnels, fly sideways, and is stable in windy conditions. Survivability. Not only is it armoured, but it's also equipped with the unique VTEPS, or President's Defensive Aid Suite. Objectively, it's the best electronic warfare system fitted to a helicopter. You might say that's just talk, unless you've seen real cases where it diverts MANPADS missiles. Runway 616-32. Attack from the front, then ambulance. Attack from the left. Where is it? It's alright, it's alright. It's moving away. Go left, go on. So, what do we see? In 26? Well, we see several rather unpleasant moments for this splendid machine. Regardless of how packed with upgrades this machine is, there are key problems that prevent this helicopter from operating the way it used to before. Namely, if before it was possible to launch a sudden attack on your opponent, to take off and leave from a concealed spot, now it's simply impossible. Because thanks to cheap and high-altitude UAVs, which are literally watching and seeing everything, it's just impossible for this helicopter to go unnoticed. Accordingly, this makes the helicopter quite a vulnerable target. Another nuance is the aerial minefield. Nowadays, not only can you be hit by a MANPADS missile in the air, but at low altitudes, UAVs, specifically FPV drones, also like to patrol. At medium altitude, where the helicopter can still ascend and remain invulnerable. For FPV drones, military air defense is already in operation. Tors, Panzers, Bucks and so. What this tells us is that the helicopter simply no longer has a safe altitude band. And that's precisely why we've seen helicopters recently operating like MLRS with rotors. namely by firing with cabling tactics. This is essentially the main method of helicopter operation now. We simply lift the nose up by 20 to 30 degrees and launch a continuous stream of S-8 or S-13 rockets along a ballistic arc. Of course, the effectiveness of this method is extremely low, as you can imagine. After all, this is on the level of a grad system which was invented back in the 1960s when no one really knew much about precision weaponry back then, and it was only just the first and second generations being developed. To put it into perspective, it's like taking an expensive electron microscope and using it to hammer in nails. So, as you can imagine, there's not much point to it. The only real chance for the Ka-52, and this is largely thanks to the engineers, is the ELMA system, or the 305 missile. A lightweight, multi-purpose parallel missile. It's like having an FPV drone on board the helicopter with a range of 14.5 kilometers. And this is the only thing that allows the helicopter to strike without entering the air defense zone. So, essentially, the helicopter has been reduced to the role of a flying launch platform. And even if you take the Apache, the situation there is likely to be even worse, because the very best modification of the Hellfire, if I'm not mistaken, allows it to strike at a range of only 10 kilometers. And our beloved ground attack aircraft are joining this crowd as well. The problem with ground attack aircraft is that they operate according to a certain concept. I see with my own eyes, I shoot at point blank range. Yes, ground attack aircraft really can carry some missiles. They're very, very basic and very, very safe for most countermeasures. The most effective tools for ground attack aircraft are their cannons. These are 30mm aircraft cannons and unguided rockets, which are pretty much the same as those used by helicopters. And in order to strike, the pilot has to enter the zone of guaranteed destruction. Yes, that's partly why we've grown so fond of ground attack aircraft. It's a very brave and rather suicidal business. In today's reality, at a speed of 800 km per hour, a pilot is physically unable to spot a camouflaged tank in a forest belt. After all, tanks are terrified of FPV drones like the plague. Meanwhile, that same drone can hover for half an hour and inspect every bush. An aircraft has only a few seconds to make decisions, which is why now drones are actively taking over this task, the very same drones. If not FPV drones, then loitering munitions, lancets, switchblades, and so on. We're looking at the simple mathematics of war. Let's say we have a Su-25, right? There's a high risk to the pilot, and it takes a very long time and a lot of money to train a pilot. There's also a risk to the aircraft, yes. Even if the aircraft isn't completely put out of action, that is, destroyed, repairs are rather expensive, and the aircraft themselves are old. We know that every aeroplane, every flying vehicle has a service life, including the airframe, because the materials aren't exactly long-lasting. They also tend to degrade over time. At the same time, again, the Su-25s are doing the same sort of cabling work as the Ka-52s, so it's extremely expensive for very little effectiveness, because getting an aircraft airborne also costs a fair bit of money. And that's precisely why an old-timer like the A-10 will simply be retired. The official reason being that it wouldn't survive in a modern war. And the same thing is happening with the PAC-SHARE or Shershon program, that is the Prospective Aviation Complex for ground attack aviation. Its future is so uncertain that most likely we simply won't see it, and meanwhile, by the end of this decade, the Su-25 will simply be written off, as it's also a rather worn-out aircraft. And here we can see a general trend. Both helicopters, Apaches, Ka-52s and so on, and aircraft like the Su-25 and A-10 were originally designed as tank killers. Of course, we destroy certain notional moving targets, we support the troops, but first and foremost, we're hunting tanks. So what's happening with tanks now? Yes, of course, some will say it's a death trap, that their time has passed and so on, but in reality, tanks will still be in use for a long time yet. They'll probably just change a bit. Meanwhile, these means will gradually be retired more and more, because there are loads of ways to destroy a tank that are much simpler, cheaper and safer. And even if we say, alright, let's make unmanned helicopters, we won't be able to produce 1,000 Ka-52s, we simply can't build such a large machine in those numbers quickly, whereas 1 million drones can be made much more easily, much faster, and with far fewer requirements. Because by the time drones are officially adopted by the armed forces, and some drones have already been officially accepted, how much evolution have FPV drones already undergone? We're already seeing entire cities that look like spiderwebs, a lair, because fibre optic drones simply cover these cities, and modern warfare now resembles a battle of drones against drones. It's all about who controls their drones better and who has more of them. Alright, fair enough. We can say we've realised that the attack helicopter class is already dying out, but aviation itself is far from dead, it's just moving to the rear. That's because there are things that aviation handles better than anything else. Of course, we're not talking about transport planes, that's all obvious. There's a wonderful thing that saves lives called casualty evacuation. And here, helicopters are simply irreplaceable. Ground-based stretcher robots are rather slow, and it's only the helicopter that can provide that crucial golden hour. And it's precisely on this battlefield that the unremarkable helicopters like the Mi-8 reign supreme. Boring, as they say, but everlasting, because it's not for nothing that it's called multi-purpose. And it will keep performing its function for a very, very long time, and overall it's an excellent machine. Let's also not forget about logistics and air taxis. For example, rapid deployment of special forces. Well, you know yourself, it's not exactly convenient to drive to the location by car, whereas you can get there fairly quickly by helicopter. Despite everything, countries continue to spend billions of dollars on helicopters. Take the Chinese, for example. The Chinese are definitely ahead of the game in some respects, and they certainly know something. While the US is shutting down its helicopter programs, China rolled out the Z-21 in 2024 to 2025. This is a heavy attack helicopter that looks very much like the Apache, but it's even bulkier. And why is that? Of course, it's because there's a rather splendid island where semiconductors are made, which China considers part of its own territory. But let's have a look at the geography ourselves. Taiwan is an island. It's difficult for tanks to get across there. But helicopters can fly there themselves and support the landing on their own. At the same time, in a naval landing operation, FPV drones make very little sense, whereas their range is affected by the wind and they're rather vulnerable to these factors. At the same time, a helicopter can carry heavy missiles, destroy bunkers, and all the necessary tasks during a naval landing operation. So yes, in that sense, the helicopter is quite alive and will continue to be so. In other words, these are very niche, specialised operations where it's hard to find an alternative. And then there are the Italians, who are going against the whole world, really. They've created the Phoenix, a helicopter of that vein. Right now, they're putting it into mass production. They're investing almost 5 billion euros into it. And essentially, the Phoenix is the first helicopter designed specifically to work with drones. The pilot in the cockpit doesn't just fire weapons, he controls a swarm of UAVs flying ahead. Essentially, we see that the helicopter is like a flying aircraft carrier, or a sort of mother to the drones. And at the same time, it serves as a command post. It won't be diving into the thicker things, it won't be using cannons or rocket pods. Instead, it'll be sending in its robots, its workhorses, to handle all those tasks. The US, as we mentioned, is already cancelling the FARA program and focusing on FLRAA. So in 2014, they shut down the program and say that in a war with China or Russia, a reconnaissance helicopter simply wouldn't survive. Because drones will do the job instead. So the Americans aren't daft, they understand all this perfectly well. But they're pouring money into the V-280 Valor, only it's not a helicopter, it's a tiltrotor aircraft. It flies very fast and very far. It's faster than a helicopter. A helicopter's average speed is about 250 to 300 kilometers per hour, but this one does 500. But the task here is a bit different. Here, the task is actually closer to that of an air taxi. That is, to quickly reach the drop-off point for special forces, strike, get the job done and fly back before the enemy's air defences have time to react. And there's another interesting trend called helicopters for the poor. These are light attack helicopters based on civilian models, fitted with cheap rockets. Of course, these are intended for local conflicts and local wars, for example in Africa, the Middle East, and for fighting guerrillas and terrorists. That is, in places where the enemy doesn't have pantsir systems and can't afford proper helicopters accordingly. And in principle, proper helicopters aren't really needed in such conditions because they take longer to learn to fly and so on and so forth. It's cheap, effective, and overall, why not give the slipper wearers a bit of a fright this way? Those were some thoughts on helicopters and attack aviation for today. What do you think about this? Let us know in the comments.